Good morning or hello everyone. I welcome you to the second part of the EEG curriculum provided by PUC. So let's just jump right into the game. So the topics for today, we're gonna learn some technical aspects of the recording. So please excuse me, everything is rearranged from the writings, but I hope you're still gonna see it. We're going to understand the electrode placement system called 1010 or 1020 system. We're going to gain familiarity with the amplifiers and with some very important aspects of EEG recording, namely the artifact recognition. So we're going to show you some examples of artifacts that all of you should know if you are going to read some EEGs. And those aspects of artifacts are more important than you are used to them from ECG recording, because there are several other artifacts that don't occur in the ECG recording that are important for EEG recording. So please be aware.
Ich habe ein Seminar und ich versuche auch abzunehmen.
There will be the EEG case. Wait, there's some noise here. Oh. So first, the amplifiers. Well, this is a very basic picture, but please be aware, or maybe you just visualize how an EEG is recorded. The first thing is, and what you actually know, is that there are electrodes placed on the scalp. And this was what I showed you the last time. Those electrodes always measure some kind of differential of the potentials occurring from the neuronal activity. And here you can see an example. So there are some caps, like you can see on the left, where the electrodes are woven into the cap. Some other systems prefer like a net. So we have some kind of elastic net where the electrodes are placed. And sometimes, for example, in EEG sleep laboratories, you're going to glue the electrodes themselves on the scalp. How you have to place them, we will see later. But what then is important, from the scalp, of course, there are some cables going to the amplifier. And the amplifiers used to be huge. So if you remember the pictures from Gerhard Berger last time, there were huge machines standing in the corner of the rooms. Nowadays, those amplifiers are quite small. There are even some solutions where you could use your smartphone as an amplifier. And there are also very small, like credit card format amplifiers that are capable of transmitting the signal via WLAN or via Bluetooth. So those amplifiers now decreased in size. However, there are several limits. As you can see, the amplitude of the scalp activity, so the power that is generated by your brain, is quite small. So those amplifiers really need to amplify literally amplify those signals that it will be visible on the screen. So on the right side, you can now see a schematic view of this. So there are the electrodes. They record the differential potentials. There's the amplifier that could be large or small, and then the signal is transmitted toward your EEG screen. And what you there see is the curves that we are likely to interpret in the end, may it be for scientific reasons or be it for clinical reasons. Okay, so again, the signals that the EEG is measuring are very tiny. That means they are in the range of microvolts. And now go back to the ECG. If you are a physician, the ECG, so the activity produced by the heart, normally ranges in the range or is in the range of millivolt. So this is it's 3 magnitudes. So this means the signal that comes from the heart is much larger than the signals that come to the brain, and this is why we need to amplify it. The activity that we measure is quite divergent. We measure signals from 1.1 hertz to 100 hertz or even above. That means 0.1 hertz is that every 10 seconds the cycle is concluded. So this is a very slow activity. So again, to take the example of the ECG, there's no ECG activity that is going over under 0.1 hertz, so 10 seconds. So this is a very slow activity. And on the other side, we have the very high frequency activity to 100 hertz or even above. They are not important for clinical purposes, but they are important for more scientific purposes. Another important aspect is called impedance. impedance is something we know if you like to play with your electric pads in the past when you were a child. You know that impedance is something that is there if current is flowing, and the resistance a flowing current experiences is called impedance. And to be exact, the impedance is the resistance you have when you place the electrode on the scalp. You have the fat, you have the skin, you have maybe sweat. So the current does not go into, or you cannot measure the current coming from the brain. But you're going to measure the currents that from outside the brain. So there's a kind of barrier, and this is what we describe as the impedance. And this is what we have to get low. If you have a very high impedance, we will not be able to measure the brain's activity, but we got to get some noise signal. And even more importantly, that to decrease impedance, so the resistance from every electrode below 5K, which is some kind of magical threshold. But what might be even more important is that all the electrodes, you have multiple electrodes, have the same impedance. Because if one electrode has, let's say, right below 5K, let's say 4K, and the others have 0.5K, so very, very small impedance, this one electrode will disturb all the other electrodes, because there no measurement will be possible, because the current always seeks its way to the least impedance. So it's very important to keep them similar. And maybe two other things in the end. The materials from the electrodes, it's for example from silver or silver chloride, and that is very sustainable and helps to record best signals. So now let's leave those theoretical things, but they're important to remember, and let's go to the localization of the electrodes. So the electrodes themselves are placed according to the so-called 10-20 system, and this is what most of the people use in the clinical settings. And 10-20, it's very easy to remember, because you have two very important points on the brain or on the skull. First, there's the so-called nasion. You can see it on the left side. The nasion is the deepest point, let's call it deepest point between your eyes. It doesn't go deeper, the bone inside toward your head. So this is called the nasion. And on the back, if you touch yourself on the back, you're going to feel a small, let's say, hill on the scalp. So the most prominent point at the back of your head, and this is called inion. And then remember the name, the 10-20 system. For the first electrode, you move 10% of the head circumference, which is 360 degrees, of course. You remember the circle from geometry. So you move 10% of the circumference, you move toward the top. And there is where you have the first electrode, which is called FP1 or FP. And then the second is 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 10%. So if you count together, altogether you're gonna have 100%. So don't take me literally what I said with 360 degrees. So this is not the degrees, but this is the percentage from the inion to the nasion. So individually you have very similar percentages, but the placement occurs different. So this is how we individualize the electrode placement on the scalp. And the same is done on when you look at the head from above. So this is the nose, this is the front, nasion, inion, again 10%, and you got the first, and then 20, 20, 20, 20, and then again 10%. So this is how you have to place the electrodes. Maybe another important point is the so-called vertex, which is the highest point. So in the end, if you placed your cap and place the electrodes, do me a favor and do a last check. Look at the C-set electrode and be sure this is the highest point of the head. So this will be the point where you measure the height of the person. The C-set electrode should be above all, should rule them all, so to say. Okay. So if you're here from the scientific perspective, the 10-20 system is very coarse, as you see. You know, you cannot do like very exact localizations. So what you do is you use a 10-10 system, and there's a 10-5 system where you place all the electrodes every 10%. So you almost double the placements or the number of electrodes, as you see here. And maybe what's important also, what I told you last time, the numbers and the letters are very easy to remember. O is for occipital, P is for parietal, C is for central, F is for frontal, and the numbers Odd numbers are on the left, even numbers are on the right. The higher numbers are more outside and the smaller numbers are in between. And the last thing to remember is the set, the central, in German Zentral, it's in the midline. So if you remember this and someone says, well, at F6 I recorded a strange signal, you will know that it's on the right side of the frontal region, and you can already place it in your imagination. Okay, so before we come to our daily case, maybe one interesting thing, and maybe we're going to dedicate a special seminar to that, but for all of you that are here for scientific reasons, it's important that we can do source localization using EEG. So all we saw now is the electrode traces at the 2D picture. And you see F3, the electrode recorded that signal, C3 recorded this signal, and so on. And we can see it here on the right side on the placement from above. You can see, okay, the most prominent alpha activity, O1, O2, is here, signature red. So you can see where it happens on the skull. But can we also dive into the brain? And yes, we can, using something called source localization. And this is how you see in the occipital brain, the activity is largest for this alpha activity, where you can see the envelope printed in red. So how does this work? Well, let's dive into that. So this is the source localization. We can localize where the activity comes from in the brain. And I'm going to show you in a short thing why we do this and how we do this. The problem is why we do this localization is the following. As you can see here, we have two sources, a blue one and the red one, and we record an activity. So the difference between the two electrodes, and you can see a wave. However, if we have two sources here and one source here that add up to the same, we're going to get the same signal. And now compare the two sources. It's different sources, one source here, one source here, same signal as when we record two small sources and one large source here, we get the same signal. And again, we can play around and even displace the sources slightly in accordance and still get the same signal. So that means on the surface of the head, those signals look the same, and we have to dive into source localization to learn that the sources where the signal comes from is different. And how does this work? It works by means of dipoles. So that is electrical activity can always be represented as a dipole, which is a vector in space, as you can see over here. And how does it work? Let's go into the brain and we zoom into the gray substance. And here you see small neurons. And what you see is every neuron, and this is just a schematic view, every neuron has or does the same on the cortical surface. They are pointing toward one direction, which is the resulting activity, which is red. So every red arrow represents a neuron. So what happens if we learned this the last time, if the neurons are all sending activity in different direction, what is resulting vectors in different directions? And this is a so-called desynchronized activity. We don't find anything. Resulting vector is 0. Now we have many vectors that point toward a similar direction, not the same, but similar direction. So which might be, let's say, a gyrus, as you see over here in the back. And if you now compare them together, we get a resulting activity, which is one large vector pointing toward one direction. This is a so-called dipole. And if you know the dipole in the brain, we know how to localize it. This is what we do. We have the brain. Let's watch this video. We have the electrodes. And from all the electrodes, we try to calculate down where in the head is the most probable solution of the activity we see on the surface of the head. So this is what we do in the end. We remove the electrodes and look into the brain to learn in the end where the source of the activity is. And this is what source localization does. All right. So I know we're now jumping a little bit back and forth from one topic to the other, but now that you learned about a more scientific topic, the source localization, which you can apply, but which has no real reason to be there in the clinical setting of psychiatry, I'm now going to show you something that all of us, or affects all of us, which is the artifacts. because also for source localization, it's very important that you always have a clear signal. If you try to localize some activity that is not from the brain, let's say some muscle artifacts, these computer algorithms will show you that it's somewhere in the brain, but it is of course not, because it was generated by some other sources. So the first example is a so-called muscle artifact. Muscle artifacts occur if you have, for example, the musculus temporalis. We know it's on the side of our heads, and if we press our teeth together, then those muscles will generate very fast activity. And here you see a 10-second trace, and again you see those very like black occurring lines with very high amplitude, high frequency activity, and this is the sign. This is the sign of a muscle activity. So this is what you see over here where my mouse is. This is the muscle activity artifact, which has to be removed or is not to be taken into account for interpretations. The second artifact I'm going to show you is a so-called swallow artifact, and you can see the technician was nice and wrote a marker here and said swallow, so which is schlucken, which is German for swallow. And here you see the artifact that occurs. So it's a kind of muscle artifact all over different electrodes. And in the end, you know that this wave is not a physiological CNS wave, but it occurs because the patient or the subject swallowed. Let's go to another kind of artifacts, which is the eye artifact. And here you're going to see a very typical eye artifact. As you see, this very large amplitude, and it not only occurs, and this is very important, in the electrodes of this head, but also, as you can see, in the EEG, which is the electrooculogram, which records the eye activity. And you see the largest amplitude is recorded in the EEG, which is a sign that it might be an eye artifact. But also we see that it's very large at frontal areas, at the F electrodes, which means, okay, this might be eye shrink or something recorded from the eye. We will learn later some methods to extract those artifacts, but at first, just remember those large amplitude changing potentials are most likely eye artifacts. And last but not least, this is something we did not record. I took it from the internet. I'm sorry, there's no source there, but it's a technical artifact. And you can see over here, again, the electrodes, and you see the F3 electrode, which is doing some funny thing, a repeated pattern that doesn't look like real physiological activity. And if you localize it with the so-called independent component analysis, which most of programs and softwares nowadays provide, you see that this signal, this independent component, is located only at one electrode. And everything that is only at one electrode is very suspect of being an artifact. And in this case, it's not an eye artifact or another artifact, but it's a technical artifact, meaning that this electrode, for example, has a high impedance. Remember, that was the resistance of the electrode measured how good the current can flow between. And last but not least for today, before we get into the case, I'm going to show you the ECG artifact. And this is very important because sometimes it's really, you don't know where it comes from, but it's just very simple. It's from the heart. And if you look at this trace, you see at the bottom, we marked it with a pink color. You see the ECG, so the heart activity, a clear ECG with a P, Q, or S, and T wave. If you now look at the ECG, at the EEG, you see that here we have those patterns that occur very rhythmically with a range of 1 per second. So here, down here, you have the seconds, 1 per second, so to say. And you have it over many electrodes, A2, A1, and so on. And if you now look down at every R peak of the ECG, you see those patterns occur. So this is what tells you clearly it's an ECG artifact and nothing else. It's no spikes, it's no paroxysmal activity, but it's the ECG activity that's recorded. This could occur if you place, for example, the electrodes over a vein or so, you have those artifacts. Maybe one question, do you know what this kind of artifact you see over here, what this might be? And yes, you're right. If you guess that it's an eye artifact, yes, this is again an eye artifact. The patient was blinking. Okay, here again, please take your smartphone. We also share the link, of course. This is the link to our quiz for today's
short clicker quiz for all of you short questions just to reaffirm also what you learned today. And please use either the link or the QR code. You get straight to our clicker session where you get session 1, the last session, and the new questions for this week. And you get new questions every week. And you could also create a login with the pin code of the course so you can participate in the gamification and get some points. So please enjoy our quizzes via the link. Thanks a lot.
This is the patient from the daycare clinic, which ADHS, and his medication was Concerta, so a stimulant, and bupropion, so an antidepressant, which both are likely to evoke ETPs and epileptic activity. The patient had a history of epileptic seizures before he was 25, and so we just did a routine EEG before changing the medication. And what we see here is the beginning of the ECG. Again, we have 10 seconds. Remember to place, always use the same distances and time. I use 10 seconds. I'm used to that. Make yourself a reference and use it. We also have the average reference as last time. I always start with that. And we have the amplitude of 50 microvolt, the same as I did last time. This is my initial screen. You can have your own, but make it the same all the time. So now we have the starting here. At the bottom, we have the timeline again, and we see here eyes closed. And as we see here, those eye artifacts, of course, it's blinking and the eyes are getting closed. And now the eyes have been closed, and we clearly see an activity at occipital leads, which is this alpha activity I showed the last time. So the ground rhythm of the brain occurs. However, it doesn't stay for long. You see the alpha rhythm still present at 01, disappears already after 10, 20 seconds. And what happens is this patient very easily goes into slower activity. Remember, you have the horizontal eye movements kicking in. So this patient is very, very drowsy. Okay. And if we proceed here, we don't have alpha activity anymore, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We already get theta activity. So this patient within 1 minute got from very high alertness and alpha activity toward theta activity and drowsiness. We learned from the document that he already took a stimulation medication and still is very drowsy. So it seems that the medication is not sufficient from the electrophysiological point of view. However, this is not the only thing we need to look for. We also look for epilepsy typical potentials, and we screen for that. And this is what first occurs here. So this is where the technician, also very aware, made the first mark. And what we see over here, I make it smaller in amplitude, we see a clear spikes with also a spike wave configuration. So these small things are marked for you. This is a spike. A spike is a large change of amplitude within less than 170 milliseconds with a large change of amplitude. And then you have a slow declining wave following after. So this is a typical epilepsia typical potential, an ETP. And this is something that is present either interictal or if you have a wrong medication and so on. So yes, we found some ETPs in this patient, and we continue to see how much more of them we have here. Again, it's a very drowsy patient. You see here the pattern of very slow activity, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so even slower, very drowsy. We again see here the slow waves of the ECG, almost sleeping. And as you continue with the ECG, we see more spikes occurring. Let's see some more. Here. So here again, we get the different spikes. And maybe as we continue, we have very slow activity. So patient already sleeping and having ETPs. What is interesting now, and I want to show you now, which is also important for EEG in the clinical context, is that we now said, okay, this patient has ADHD, is under stimulant medication, which seems not to be sufficient because he still got a lot of vigilance problems in the EEG. But we also discovered that there are ETPs, and in a patient with a history of epileptic seizures, we might be or must be very careful when increasing drugs like bupropion or stimulants. So what we told them, please be very careful when increasing the stimulants. and make a re-EEG every now and then. That means every several weeks, or at least every 3 months. And what I show you now is the next EEG we have from that patient. So let me see if I have the next one. Yes. So this is from December, so 1 month later. So what we see over here, this is the beginning of the recording, and they increased the concerta, so the stimulant. And what we see now that there's a clear increase of alpha activity, as you can now see here. So this is again the starting of the ECG, the EEG, and we see that the alpha activity is much higher, much more stable. You see the whole screen. There is alpha activity going on with very large amplitude. So the vigilance increased, and the patient reportedly was doing better with the increased medication. However, if we scroll through the ECG, we see that alpha is better, but in the end, and I now switch to that, we still have some ETPs, as you can see over here. After 5 minutes of recording, we again have this spike and wave configuration, multiple spike waves. We can also change, as we learned last time, the montage to learn where its origin is. It's mainly a frontal, thing. So again, there are still ETPs there, although not increasing too much while dosing new medication. And in the end, we had a last EEG. I'm not able to show you today due to time reasons. Again, we increased the concerta even more, but then more ETPs occurred, and we sent the patient to a neurologist. One could also think about changing medication or implementing some anti-epileptic medication. However, in this case, we seek the help of a neurologist and to figure out what medication would be best. So, short story long. Thank you very much for attending this today's curriculum. You have 1 minute left for asking questions if you have some. Otherwise, the recording will be available online soon, and you will be able to revisit everything you saw. We have one question. Benjamin, you have a question.
Hi, Sebastian. Thank you so much. Just a question: when you showed the presentation, the EOG wasn't differentiated between, EOG wasn't differentiated between horizontal and vertical, and in this EG with the EOG, you have that differentiation. Is that always the case that you can separate that? Is there also separation between left and right? And the second question would be, where do you need it? Like I understood to see the artifacts general, but do you also need that differentiation between horizontal and vertical eye movement, and where do you need it?
Yeah, but that's a very, very good question. Due to practical reasons in clinical settings, sometimes you only use one EOG, then it makes a mixture of both. So you have a diagonal recording, which records vertical and horizontal movement at the same time. So you don't have differentiation then. It's not so good for differentiation, but however, you can use a trick. For example, you have the F2 and the F1 and F8. F7 and F8, so very external frontal electrodes. They are placed here, and here you record only the horizontal. So then you can differentiate a little bit between the activity. However, for really distinguishing between horizontal and vertical activity, it's best to have both. And in our recordings, I see Miss Atanadova is here, which is a technical technician from our, and also Anja Rüsch. And they are here. I think for our setting at the PUC, we use EOG, horizontal and vertical, so you can differentiate between the both. And the second question, I forgot.
And where do you I understood that you use the EOG to see the artifacts from the eye movements, but also this differentiation between horizontal and vertical. Do you also use it for further analysis? So not only to see if the eyes were moving, but do you also use it differently for other things?
Yeah. So the only other thing, I mean, there are things where you look, for example, if you have those saccades from the more neurological point of view, from the psychiatric point of view, what you can clearly see and what is a very good and important measure is, as you see, if you look at the screen again, you have this slow eye rolling movements, as you see over here. For example, here you have a rolling eye movement over several seconds. And this means the patient is very tired. So if you look, maybe we go in the beginning, here you see a normal EEG, someone has saccades looking around. But if you have slow and smooth, like here, slow and smooth over several hundred microvolt, the patient clearly is tired. And I think this is very important because you can see if you have someone who says, I didn't sleep the last 5 nights, I had no sleep at all, but in the EEG and EOG, there's a very straight line and no signs of drowsiness, then there must, either he doesn't need sleep or he slept well. So this is something you can try to validate what the patient tells you and what the recording tells you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Welcome. So any other questions? So otherwise, thanks for attending. Don't hesitate to ask questions the next time. Stay tuned and thanks for attending. Bye-bye.